Hello, everyone. I'm Carole Goldberg, the Jonathan D. Verrett Distinguished Professor of Law Emerita here at UCLA School of Law. And thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest installment of From the Frontline, where UCLA law faculty, alumni, and friends discuss the legal, social, and political issues that are at the heart of the current conversation. Today's program is titled Native Nations Rising, Progress and Promise, and focuses on the organization, the legal challenges, and the legal advocacy that have contributed so much to the growing influence of Native nations on the national scene and recognition of their sovereignty and cultures. For today's panel, we are extraordinarily fortunate to be joined by Native law experts, tribal leaders, for a discussion about the progress and promise of Native nations across the United States. And I am just thrilled to introduce our highly distinguished group of panelists. And I will do so in alphabetical order. First, I'd like to welcome John Echohawk, citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and executive director and co-founder of the Native American Rights Fund, which is at the forefront of providing legal assistance to Native nations and Native nation citizens across the nation. Throughout his distinguished career, Mr. Echohawk has long been seen as a leading voice in the field of Native law. In fact, the legislative advocacy and legal victories that he has achieved not only have transformed Native law and advanced the rights of Native nations and their citizens, but it has also inspired the public interest law movement much more broadly than just Native law. In addition to his work at the Native American Rights Fund, Mr. Echohawk serves on the boards of the Indigenous Language Institute, the Association of American Indian Affairs, the Natural Resources Defense Council, just to name a few. Very, very pleased to be welcoming you to this program. Next is my dear friend and colleague, Professor Angela Riley, citizen of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma. She is a renowned Indigenous rights scholar. Here at UCLA, she is the director of our MA-JD Joint Degree Program in Law and American Indian Studies. She is also the director of our Law and Policy Center. She is the driving force for all things Native law at UCLA. In addition to her prominent career as a scholar, she is justice and has been, or is, Chief Justice of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma's highest court. She also serves as co-chair for the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Partnership Policy Board, which is a commitment to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In shorthand fashion, I describe Professor Riley as the person who makes my own life possible. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Chairman Greg Sarris, Tribal Chairman of the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria, who is also a dear friend and longtime colleague. Chairman Sarris has had a notable career in academia, serving on the faculty here at UCLA, but also at Loyola Marymount and Sonoma State University, and occupying endowed chairs. Recently, he was named to the very prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Congratulations on that. He's the author of numerous books, including his most recent collection, How a Mountain Was Made, one of his collections made into an HBO miniseries. And in addition to his academic and creative pursuits, Chairman Sarris was leading the way in the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria effort to restore their federal recognition. And in his role as chairman, oversees all the business negotiations and daily operations and political relations of the tribe. And I should add that one of his roles very close to home is his service as president of or chair of the Native American Advisory Council for the office of the UC president. He was appointed by our former president, Janet Napolitano, and he occupies a leadership role also on the board of the National Museum of the American Indian, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. So we are truly blessed today. Welcome, panelists, and let's get started. So I'm going to begin with a question to my colleague, Professor Riley, and I'll provide a bit of a preface to it. Namely that since 1924, citizens of Native nations have also been United States citizens. That's less than 100 years. In addition, Native nations have a complex and legally recognized status as governments with inherent sovereignty and relationships that connect them to the United States, including often by treaty. So this is a very complex set of arrangements, one that we need some help understanding. So with that background, can you help our audience understand the ways in which Native nations function and advocate within the American political system, both separately and in concert, because there are more than 500.
Yes, thank you, Professor Goldberg. And I just want to start off by saying thank you to everyone for putting this panel together. And I'm beyond honored to be one of 4 in this group of incredible people. And so it's just delightful to see you all and a pleasure to be here. I am coming to you live from Los Angeles. I'm on the unceded land of the Tongva peoples, the Aboriginal owners of this territory. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Yeah, let me start by just giving a little bit of background on Native nations within the United States. I know that we have a large audience today, and some of you are probably experts in Indian law, and some of you may not be very familiar with the field at all. So I'll just give some basic context for the conversation that we'll have. As Professor Goldberg mentioned, there are over 500 federally recognized Indian tribes in the US. In fact, there are 574. A little over 200 of those are Alaskan Native villages. Native nations control more than 60 million acres in the lower 48 and have enormous range of cultures and resources and relationships with their communities and with one another, and in some ways with the federal government. Native nations, one of the things I tell my students that they're always sort of surprised to know if they haven't been steeped in the field is to understand that Native nations have inherent sovereignty, meaning our sovereignty doesn't emanate from another sovereign. The federal government doesn't give it to us. States don't give it to us. It's inherent to us, and it existed at the point of contact. So that sets up the framework for understanding that at the time that contact happened between colonizing powers and indigenous peoples on this continent, we were already here, organized in sovereign nations of enormous breadth in terms of diversity, of language, of culture, of organization in all kinds of ways. And so that sets up the framework for understanding that when the Constitution eventually was ratified, we were not brought within the Constitution. Tribes were not at the Constitutional Convention. We are explicitly mentioned in the US Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't apply to us in the way that it does the federal government and the states. So when we talk about Indian tribes in the US having sovereignty, this is what we're talking about. We have our own independent governments, our own court systems, our own constitutions. We have the power to tax and incarcerate. We have the power, although limited in some ways, to police and to regulate. And we govern our own people and our own territory, but always within the context of domestic dependent nations, which is within the shadow of the plenary power of Congress. So, so many people don't really understand that we have this common history in the sense of being federally recognized tribes, and at the same time, this enormous diversity, because we have vastly different cultures, Tribes range from being very small in number to quite vast, from having large numbers of native speakers to very few, to having enormous land bases, to having very small land bases. Economic development sees the same kind of variety and range, as well as culture and other points of organization. So one of the things that I think is important for people to understand is that while we have this shared history, and very important in some ways, I think, kind of shared cultural commitments and shared life ways in many respects, there's also enormous diversity amongst and between tribes. And that makes for a really interesting kind of navigation of the political system and of our relationships with each other and the federal government.
Thank you so much. That captured a lot in a very short period, so thank you. I'm going to tee up the next question to both John Echohawk and to Greg Sarris. And it is the following. How do you think the establishment and strengthening of Native nations in the United States has led to political mobilization and perhaps overlooked constituencies finding a political voice in state, local, and national settings? So really a focus on the strengthening of Native nations and what impact that's had on the political relations that those nations have with federal, state, and local governments. John, you want to start?
Okay. Thanks, Carole, and I'm pleased to be participating here on this panel this afternoon. The Native American Rights Fund, as you mentioned, was started in 1970, 50 years ago, and that was at a time of federal policy where they had been terminating tribes, doing away with the government-to-government relationship that had existed under the treaties and the laws. They were forcing the assimilation of our people, relocating us to the cities, all again without asking us anything about it. So when the civil rights movement came along in the 60s, and they asked our people, about civil rights and equal rights, which was the focus of the civil rights movement, our people said, no, we want our treaty rights. Quit terminating us, quit assimilating us, let us be Indians. And so that really took off, and we gave life to that by providing legal representation for the first time through our Native American Rights Fund. We were the poorest of the poor. Most of our people, most of our tribes had no lawyers. And so here were all these needs for legal representation that we started fulfilling, and started bringing treaty rights cases, enforcing these rights that Angela was talking about that exist, under the laws of this country, since we're inherent sovereign nations, and that they're recognized by the treaties. And it really kind of changed everything. The federal government changed its policy to one of recognition of Indian self-determination, the right of Indians to be Indians and determine their own futures, and to honor the treaties and exist as sovereign nations within this U.S. federal system. And that really took off, and tribes kind of started learning to work together because they all shared this sovereignty, and they knew that they needed to join forces to hold that together, because of course there was a lot of resistance against that. People didn't generally know about tribal sovereignty, and there was just kind of strength in numbers as tribes got together and started educating people about our status in this country. In particular, the National Congress of American Indians, the National Intertribal Organization, led the effort there, bringing all the tribal leaders together, forming common positions, and making that known to the Congress and administration, and helping us with our work in the courts as well. We really started finding a voice there. Our biggest problem had always been most people didn't know anything about us, and again, as we came together, started working together, and reaching out, to the administration, the Congress, the courts, the governors, the state legislatures, educating them about all this, the state attorney generals. There was gradually an understanding of our place within this federal system, which is basically composed of the federal government, the state governments, and the tribal governments. So this system of intergovernmental relationships started, and it's grown as people have become educated about us, and we have worked with them to make things better for our people and our surrounding non-Indian neighbors.
Thank you so much. That really has been, very transformational, both litigation and advocacy. And I know it's also addressed voting rights of individual tribal citizens. Is that right?
Yes, it sure has. We have come to realize that in many instances, the politicians that are elected at the federal and state level haven't really paid much attention to us because they didn't really know much about us. And as they kind of learned about us, some of them have been supportive, some have not been supportive. And our people have noticed among these federal and state officials who supports us and who doesn't. And they've learned the process, and that is, well, unless you vote, unless you participate in that system, then they're not going to pay any attention to you. So we have really gotten better at organizing ourselves politically and seeking out those candidates who support us, and isolate those who do not, and then turn out at the polls and make our voice known. And we've basically kind of educated ourselves that that's really very, very important, and we're doing better all the time, turning our people out to vote for those who support us.
That's great. Chairman Sarris, I know you've been very involved in political relations at all levels, and of course have seen and driven the real strengthening of your people. What's your view about how this has affected the political voice that tribal nations have had?
Well, let me just jump back a second, a little for clarification for those of all of the folks who are listening, Professor Goldberg. West of the Rockies, there's somewhat a very different history than east of the Rockies for Indigenous people, in the sense that so many tribes were created de facto tribes of survivors that were gathered and put on a rancheria by a certain area, and given the same kind of rights or treaty rights were assumed on the rancheria. So the 1910 California Indian Rancheria Act provided for small plots of land for the so-called homeless Indians of California. And what they did in so many areas is just rounded up groups of survivors here and there, and like, as in our case, said, well, these are the Indians of the Graton Rancheria. We happen to be, and if anybody on the Indian census within a certain area became a de facto designee for that tribe, enrolled possible person for that tribe. For instance, in our area, if there had been a Navajo on the Indian census here, that person would be eligible for enrollment in the tribe. So again, people say so often about California Indians, well, they're really not tribes. They're not like, the Navajo Nation or a one-on-one kind of negotiation. But of course, when the rancherias were established, it was assumed and understood that they had the same treaty rights and sovereignty as other nations, even though they were de facto tribes. And that's an important distinction for folks to understand. So here I want to talk a little bit specifically about California. I've been in Indian, the politics world for a long time. My tribe had a rancheria and then was illegally terminated in '58. And then began the battle to get our rights back, which we were able to do with President Clinton signing our bill on December 27th, 2000, restoring our rights as a sovereign nation. But here, regarding politics, most of which there's been some kind of often a split in many ways with tribes and what happens with groups on the east side of the Rockies versus what kind of has gone on here in California. As I used to like to say, until there were casinos, nobody in California knew there were Indians here. I think one of the big things that I've seen is, as a consequence of our gaming, and the finances we have, and I'm going to speak specifically here of California, it is, we made some strides, of course, through the 60s and 70s with many of the things that John was talking about. We've obviously benefited from those sorts of things, but nothing is, and I'll just be crass, nothing has given us the power that money has, our gaming here. And now the coming together of the coalition of gaming tribes here to protect what's ours as we come under attack with the card clubs and others wanting to get into our business. Mm-hmm. And so there's been a wonderful kind of coalition of folks, and the old methods that governments and others have used to divide us and conquer us aren't working. We work together. We don't take meetings separately. And it's just wonderful to walk down the halls of Sacramento, and if somebody wants to, is lobbying about a new hairspray to use, the first thing folks will say is, what do the Indians think? That's wonderful. And so things are changing there. I mean, leaders of municipalities call me, governors call me, Congress folks call me, and it's not because they necessarily like Indians. They know that we have the power, and we will use our power and money in ways to advocate to protect our sovereignty and enhance our well-being. And that's where it is now. And we feel fortunate, thankful. We fought for those things here in California. And I think we have more influence now than we've ever had, and we want to keep it. On many fronts, California, the country, the world needs us. With climate change and all that sorts of things, they need what we know, and they also need our ability to help finance the things that need to be done locally and elsewhere.
Well, thank you. And it occurred to me that there is one issue that exemplifies what you've both been talking about that links everyone here on this panel, because I'm thinking about repatriation of the ancestors and cultural items through federal advocacy by NARF, repatriation legislation at the national level, through legislation at the state level. Policy change has been mandated for the University of California, and both Professor Riley and I have participated both at the UCLA and at the UC system-wide level in establishing some of the new policy. Would you view repatriation as one of the areas where that kind of influence on the national and state political scene has made an impact?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And the policy that you referred to, Professor Goldberg, the UC system-wide one, in fact, just passed. Napolitano made it one of the last things she wanted to do. And when we were working on the advisory board, so many folks, of course, from your institution, wonderful folks, worked on that policy. And it's gotten through so that we can implement that now in the UC system. So thank everybody that's been there, and thank all the work that's been done. We can get our ancestors back, and the universities are hiring people now to even help us do that, which is great.
John, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, the repatriation law was a tremendous development that took many years to achieve. When we first started out, one of the areas we focused on was our human rights to our religions and cultures, and people didn't really know that we were still around. We still had our cultures, we still had our religions. We got the American Indian Religious Freedom Act passed in 1978, where Congress recognized that we have our own religions that are entitled to respect like everybody else's. We have our own customs and traditions. We have burial grounds that we don't control anymore, that have been taken over and basically looted, and many of our ancestors and burial goods ending up in museums. Our tribe started standing up and talking to these museums about returning those items because the tribes own those and not, not the museums. We ended up in litigation over that. We won a few cases and got the attention of the museums, and that led then to a national dialogue about the need for repatriation legislation to set up a process where our ancestors and their burial goods could be returned to our tribes by these museums that had federal support, and all that has taken off, and it's still going on today. And of course, what you guys are going through out in California is a good example of that. But it was just a tremendous way for people to come to understand that we're still here, we still have our religions, we still have our culture.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think I can attest from the involvement that I've had that the strong respect that the state legislature has come to have in California for the role of Native nations has had a very salutary influence on the University of California, its constituent campuses, in moving in a positive way towards greater repatriation. Of course, repatriation is also an international issue. It's not just an issue in the US or in California specifically. And I'd like to turn our attention to the international movement supporting Indigenous rights. And I'm wondering, and I'll put this first to you, Professor Riley, and then to anyone else who wants to join in. What impact has this international movement supporting Indigenous rights had on the legal position and overall advancement of the interests of Native nations in the US? And how do you foresee that impact of international movement developing over the next 1 or 2 decades?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. As you know, I've been pretty actively engaged in the international Indigenous rights movement for quite some time, although I think even 2 decades is sort of a short view in terms of the overall project where, tribes, I feel like, take a very long view. And people in my experience are, have waited a long time and fought a long time and don't have any intention of ever stopping until we see sort of a process of decolonization and a true respect for self-determination and Indigenous rights. And I think that staying power and that resiliency is so key to the survival of Indigenous nations in the US and beyond. I think that there's enormous opportunity. There's a long history, and I won't go into all of that history, but I would say the 2 decades that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was in draft form, with significant input from Indigenous peoples from all around the world, demonstrating their commitment to eventually coming up with a declaration that could reach the floor of the UN General Assembly, that really embodied Indigenous peoples' own ideas of self-determination and rights to equality and to non-discrimination, but also to the ability really to continue to have cultural survival, rights to religious freedom, as John was saying, rights to land, as Chairman Sarris was saying, and really those most kind of foundational things for Native nations to exist. For people out there who aren't aware, the UN Declaration was voted on by the UN General Assembly in 2007, with only 4 votes in the world against it. And those were Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States, all of which are settler nations that have similar colonial histories. One by one, all of those nations changed their votes, with the United States expressing its support with some reservations for the declaration in 2010 during the Obama presidency. And I was just prior to this speaking engagement, I was on Governor Newsom's Truth and Reconciliation Council committee meeting discussing the process of truth and reconciliation in California. And one of the questions is, how does international Indigenous rights support truth and reconciliation and restorative justice? And I think they dovetail together quite well. And I think there is a sense that has to be a process of reckoning. And just to give a little personal viewpoint, as Chairman Sarris was saying, sort of the understanding of people in California about California tribes, I'm from Oklahoma, and Oklahoma has its problems, as we all know. But you can't grow up in Oklahoma and not understand that there is a history of Indian tribes, that Indian tribes exist in our governments. There's just sort of a basic foundation of knowledge that you have, partially because many of the tribes, my own included, in Oklahoma were removed there during the removal period and have treaty relationships with the United States. Contrast that to my time in California, when moving here almost 2 decades ago, was so surprised to see how little people in California knew about Native nations in California. It's really remarkable. And part of that is really not understanding the most basic elements of dispossession, but even more devastatingly is the genocide that happened here. So I think there is a process of education and of restorative justice that is very well founded and well situated within the international Indigenous rights movement. So I'm very hopeful. I will just say one thing, and then I'll turn it over to my other panelists. We've been working here at UCLA with our Tribal Legal Development Clinic on putting together a toolkit to help tribes with their own process of implementing the declaration into tribal law. And in doing that work, we have been very fortunate to be working with the Native American Rights Fund and John Echohawk, and also with Walter Echohawk in Oklahoma, as well as the Colorado Law, to really bring together people who are interested in this work and trying to really move the needle. So I think that there are great things on the horizon, but I think that we have to stay strong and we have to stay firm, because it's not going to happen quickly.
Excellent. And I should add that this truth and reconciliation process that Professor Riley was referring to is an outgrowth of a formal apology that Governor Newsom issued maybe about a year ago. And that was really a major breakthrough, I think, in recognition in California of the history, and an opportunity to move forward in a much more positive way. Regarding the international Indigenous rights movement and its impact on the advancement of interests of Native nations in the US, would you like to add anything, John or Greg?
No, I'm not quite familiar with exactly how much they've been doing with us.
So we're all learning.
Very low.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you for the cooperation that you've lent to this initiative by our UCLA Tribal Legal Development Clinic. I know it's been tremendously valuable for our students to have that link and that opportunity to work with you and your staff. So thank you.
It's been a great experience. We have been involved in representing the National Congress of American Indians to advance the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples now for over 20 years, and we were really fortunate here in Boulder, Colorado, where we're headquartered, where the University of Colorado Law School is, to have a new dean appointed just a few years ago, James Anaya, and James Anaya had been the special rapporteur on Indigenous rights, for the United Nations. So here he was, right here in Boulder, where we were, and it was just an opportunity that he and us saw to work more closely together to advance recognition of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it was really great to be able to reach out to the UCLA Law School and Angela to get them involved in this as well, and really kind of focus on implementation of the Declaration here domestically. So that's what we're working on, and we made a lot of progress, and we've got a good ways to go, but people gradually are learning more about the UN Declaration.
That's really tremendously valuable to hear. And one of the things I didn't say when I introduced myself is that I am Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals of the Hualapai tribe. And one of the things we've been trying to pay attention to as we resolve matters on behalf of the Hualapai tribe is to the potential engagement of international Indigenous rights into the common law of the Hualapai tribe. And we found some occasions to do that, which has been really very gratifying. You know, the reference to the Obama administration finally approving U.S. Vote on behalf of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples made me think about the transition of administrations, which we're about to experience. And that leads to my next question for the panel, which is that as the Biden administration is beginning to come together, is there any consensus among tribal leaders and legal advocates about legislative priorities at the federal level? Assuming, of course, that legislation of any kind advances at the federal level. But is there any such consensus? And why or why not?
I think first and foremost, Professor Goldberg, is a protection of our sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And whatever legislation comes around that. There have been things, there's the challenge in Texas, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which if it hits the Supreme Court could set a precedent that would allow for an infringement on our sovereignty in a million ways that is dangerous. So these are things that all of us, I believe, tribal chairs, tribal people in this country are watching closely. And so any sorts of legislation that would in any way affect or challenge the sovereignty that we have, which is the only thing we really will always have. So that's the bottom line for us, I think, and there's consensus across the board on that. Small other issues, land use issues and those sorts of things, yeah, there's much consensus, but if you don't have sovereignty, you don't have anything. And mm-hmm. So we're really watching.
And I guess I should broaden my question in light of the challenges we've seen of federal legislative action to include any priorities for executive action.
Well, and then there was movement in the administration that's going to leave to, again, to deem us as racial groups and not as political groups. And that's a very important distinction to make, because as soon as the Supreme Court, let's say, decided that we were racial groups, we could no longer have sovereignty or any of the other privileges according to the Constitution. So again, as Professor Riley was talking about the treaties and the history that's here, we are consider ourselves sovereign nations, political groups, and must be continuing to be seen that way. And as I articulated earlier, that is particularly relevant for those of us here in California, the tribes in California with our particular histories.
That's very helpful to know. Mr. Echohawk, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yes, tribal leaders and legal advocates did come together, during the campaign season to make some recommendations to, the Biden-Harris ticket on what Native American policies they should adopt. And as a result of that, the Biden-Harris ticket put forth a very strong statement about supporting Native American rights and Native American issues if they were elected. And of course, they have been elected now. So the tribes are very optimistic about the chances of those campaign promises being fulfilled. All that is taking place right now through this transition team process. It's underway where tribal leaders and legal advocates are reaching out to this transition team to educate them further about the wishes and desires of the tribes and how the administration needs to follow through on those promises that they made to the tribes during the campaign. And as Chairman Sarris said right at the top, is recognition of our sovereignty and all the various aspects of that. There's other issues as well related to protection of our natural resources and our religious and cultural rights, and all that's in these documents that tribal leaders put together at the National Congress of American Indians Convention last month, a transition document that really advocates for the Biden-Harris administration to move forward implementing their campaign promises. So there's a lot of optimism out there in Indian country about the changes that are going to come, because this current administration has not been totally supportive of tribal views on a lot of these issues, and people are looking forward in our Indian community to see some change for the better.
Well, I do know that there were so many things that were advocated for and achieved during the Obama administration that the current administration almost immediately sought to undo. Solicitors' opinions, executive orders, and all of that does not require legislation, correct? If that's to be reversed and returned back to some of the policies that were fought for during the Obama administration, we don't need Congress to act. Professor Riley, do you want to?
Carole, if I may, oh, sorry.
Sure,
Carole.
you want to comment on this?
Yeah, sorry. There's a little lag, so I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah, I just wanted to throw out that I think another place that people are very optimistic is on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. As many people know, Biden was very supportive of the Violence Against Women Act. And under the reauthorization of VAWA, we had tribal provisions put into place to allow more authority for tribes over particularly domestic violence and in Indian country committed by non-Indians against Indians. So I think there is certainly a degree of optimism that something that's become a major issue, or has been for a long time a major issue, that hasn't received the attention it deserves, which are a rampant number of sexual assaults, sexual violence, domestic violence, and even cases of people going missing in Indian country, disproportionately affecting Native women and girls and others, that there'll be hopefully something that will address that. And I think there's optimism that there'll be support from the Biden administration for that. Of course, the congressional issue is going to could be a big problem, and that of course will take legislation. Although I think there at least are proposals for various types of commissions and maybe various commissions that could be set up to explore some of these issues that could get the ball rolling. And Professor Goldberg, I know you served on the Indian Law and Order Commission under Obama, which has served as sort of a model, a bipartisan model for the kind of thing that we might hopefully see in the Biden administration, even if legislation can't get through, to begin kind of gathering the data and the information that we need to put together legislation that could be successful in the future.
There may very well be a coalition that is bipartisan behind some of these initiatives, which would be very welcome, I'm sure. Well, I have a very specific question for Chairman Sarris, because of our long association, I'm aware of many of the really far-reaching endeavors he's initiated in his community on his people's ancestral territory. And my question is really how you see the position of Native nations as leaders in advancing individual and community well-being, not only within tribal Indian country, but also outside that Indian country, drawing on Indigenous values and the capabilities of Native nations.
Professor Goldberg, starting with what you said at the end there, with our Native values, again, the mission of our tribe is clearly stated: social justice and environmental stewardship. And those two things, of course, are interrelated and inseparable, as we've always seen as Indigenous people. And so when we got together here, we always said, whatever we do, whatever opportunity we have, regardless of the history, horrible history of genocide my own people suffered here. We, with any opportunity, must remember who our elders are, how they got us here, and with what opportunity we have, how can we let our ancient and timeless ethics and aesthetics of place inform everything we do. So, of course, we have a casino resort and we pay incredible wages and benefits, social justice in the workplace, and create models. With open space, what we've done are precedent-setting co-management agreements, for instance, on regional parks, now moving to the state parks. So it's not just us informing others what to do, but we have 50-50 say in ownership of those parks and how that works. That positions us to be empowered. The mitigation fees that we give the city and the county, so much of those are 50-50. We decide how that money is going to be used. They can't just use it to buy new chairs or whatever. It goes to environmental stewardship and social justice programs. So again, what you do is you create these models of partnerships that can be replicated out from what we do locally and teaching locally here, and then with our organic farming and so on. We, as you know, with UCLA school, law school, and then most recently, we gave a large donation to the Smithsonian, the MAI. I believe it's $5.7 million. To go back to what I wanted to say earlier, what's so important, education about who we are. So this money is going to supplement the Education 360 program that's there to create templates, a model template for 4th grade, 8th grade, and seniors that can be replicated in counties and communities throughout the United States. Each template, depending on difficulty, Professor Goldberg would deal with some aspect of national Indian history, state history, and local history where the school sits. Hopefully the local narrative, we believe, should be written by the indigenous people that are there. We'll create that model, that template that can be filled. Graton is going to be one of the first to implement it here in the state. I'm working with the governor to also use that as a model statewide. So again, what you do and what you learn, you of course pay attention locally, but what you can do, what you feel is so important, is do what you can nationally to advocate for all indigenous people by creating models based on those old ethics of creating a home, a safe home for all of us. We're all here together. As one of our ancestors, my great influence, Mrs. Essie Parrish, the great Kashaya shaman, said in her life, she said that there's going to be a time when the white people are going to come back and be asking us and need us for certain things. And she said to us young people, don't leave the clothes that you've been left lying around on the ground, pick them up, because the white people are going to need to see them. And I think the time is here. And now we must step forward strongly. We can't replicate colonization and what it's done to us, but we must create models based on the old way.
Beautifully said. It reminds me also of some of the models that you've created for, and you alluded to it, for labor relations within this very substantial economic enterprise that Graton Rancheria is operating. Can you say a little bit more about that?
You're putting me on my platform now that we're done talking about Graton. Can we talk about Graton? Yes, we have over 2,000 team members. Everybody who works 20 hours or more a week gets a Kaiser Gold Cadillac plan. They pay nothing out of their paycheck for full coverage. $10 deductible for brain surgery or aspirin. I need the former. And vision and dental, $2,500 non-deductible annually. When I gave Jerry Brown a tour, the first thing he said after, where's HR? I want to apply for a job. Coming from Jerry Brown, that was a lot. And we feed everybody. But the impact of that, again, the influence of that is amazing, because we're in Sonoma County, the wine country, Napa, Sonoma. And the Latinas have been exploited horribly in the hotels here. So what happens when you raise the salaries and take care of people, everybody else has to too. We're in a position where we can influence and trap people into being fair and just. Now with our organic farming, we're hoping to have the same impact on the vineyards that exploits the undocumented folks. We'll hire those undocumented folks on our organic farms, pay them the same wages and benefits here. And unless the vineyards do the same, they're going to lose all their help. I love it. That's what we're doing.
And that's why I asked the question, because I knew it was so incredibly impactful.
Yeah, one more thing too, Carol, I
Sure.
really believe this. I want to say this. As soon as we get back on our feet, the other thing that we've committed to is to take care of the non-gaming tribes that are in more remote areas in our area, so that the non-gaming tribes will receive $1 million a year or possibly more from us for their tribes, for their folks to use. And I really believe that if Indian people quit fighting and using attorneys to have us war about locally, if we took care of one another, those of us who have opportunities, nothing can stop us.
Mm-hmm.
So I really think the Graton made a commitment. It's in our compact that we would, with the state, that we'll give this money to the non-gaming tribes to take care of our neighbors. Here in California, and I think as elsewhere, I'm looking at two Indigenous people with me. Mm-hmm. Where we come from, we're related to everybody. I got more cousins than, I don't know, Moses. We need to take care of one another. And that's another thing that I think is so important and would stop any kind of warfare about territory and those other things that are going on between us.
Thank you. Well, the theme of our program today has been the strengthening of Native nations and what kind of impact that's had on the larger political scene, and your account of what's going on locally in Sonoma and Napa counties is a wonderful illustration of that. I'd like to give, as we're getting close to the closing of our program, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to just say some concluding remarks on this very subject. We've just been through an election where Native vote has gotten some serious attention, where voter suppression efforts at Indian country have been resisted, with some great organizational effort required to do that. So anything that you can forecast for us or reflect upon about our recent experience would be most welcome. Would you like to start, Professor Riley?
Sure, I'll just say a couple of words. I just want to say, first of all, I'm just so inspired by all of you here on so many different levels. So thank you for your commitment and your leadership and your vision and your optimism, because I feel like we're living in a very cynical time, and it's really lovely to hear so much optimism. I wanted to just say, in terms of impact, and say a little bit about my own tribe. My tribal chairman, Chairman Rocky Barrett, has been our chairman for more than 2 decades. He's, a close mentor and personal friend. But I think that, there is a certain shared sense of optimism, vision, leadership, commitment, and really wanting to take care of each other, and not just our Native people, but even our local communities, that I see as being part of what makes tribes successful and makes sovereignty sort of reified and then expands outward, just as Chairman Sarris was saying. So I feel like as a person who's been doing this for a while, but hopefully will be doing it longer, I want to try to imbue that same sense of optimism in my own students. And I do see it. They are hopeful about the future, and partially because they are looking to people like you three, who've really set the bar very high. And so I just want to say Chimegwech to you for that, and for being such great role models for the rest of us.
Thank you. And I guess I should have already mentioned the other current reality, which is the tremendous threat that the current pandemic is posing to so many of our tribal communities, including the Hualapai tribe, where our court is almost entirely closed because of a lockdown for the whole community. But that optimism is looking in a longer path, and very, very welcome. John Echohawk, do you want to say anything to conclude?
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on what Chairman Sarris was saying, and that is that, you know, the ongoing need for all of us to help the American public understand our tribes, Indian law policy. That is so important. We're I think getting some attention now because of what happened with the Black Lives Movement and George Floyd, and it's really kind of raised awareness here about you know, the plight of our people, and it's given us a tremendous opportunity, you know, to explain to people who we are and what our history is. We have had a growing sense of you know, the history of this country and you know, the genocide that occurred. It's resulted in this land acknowledgement that Angela started out with, where more and more people in all kinds of meetings start out with land acknowledgement now, recognizing the history of this country, that all of this land is, you know, the land that we don't have as Indian nations used to be our land, and it's ancestral lands that needs to be protected. The environmental community understands that as well, and we're very busy at this transition level talking about co-management of federal lands, because, you know, people understand that these lands used to be ours, and we still have burial sites there, cultural activities that go on there, cultural resources that need to be protected. There's this growing awareness of our tribes, and we need to expand on that and continue. And what Chairman Sarris was saying about what the NMAI is going to do would be fantastic. So we're growing, we're getting there, we're doing better. Thank you.
And thank you so much for not just this panel, but for all you've done for so many decades. Chairman Sarris, first of all, gratitude on behalf of the UCLA law community for the generosity that the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria have shown in funding full scholarships for our future students who are Native students and students interested in pursuing Native law. It's going to be hugely impactful. And we'll give you the last word.
Well, my last word, of course, is thank you to the three of you for the work you've done. As I like to say, I don't do anything, my council does everything. Mm-hmm. And we, all of you, Professor Goldberg in particular, I remember you as an undergraduate at UCLA and then as a colleague. And again, the work we were able to do during those years that I was at UCLA together. I'm so glad Professor Riley's there, and John Echohawk, you've been a model that I've watched for years. So while we watch each other and work with each other, I see you, I have great gratitude, and I will warn you that I will be calling on you for what I need. I'm not afraid to reach out. And I want to finally say, with John Echohawk saying that Black Lives Matter, I think what we're all talking about is that red lives matter. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're here. And I want to thank you for Professor Goldberg for convening this panel. I'd like to see many more like it, so that, well, at least here in California, more people know that red lives are here.
Exactly. And thank you to all of you who came to hear from our very distinguished panelists. We're grateful that we could put on this program, and look forward to your continued interest in Native issues and greater understanding of the Native peoples here in California and around the nation and the world. Thank you all so much, and thank you to our very distinguished panelists.
Thank you.
Carole.